thank you for the invitation to be here. I really appreciate it. I find that I like talking to ranchers more than any other group because they really get what I'm trying to explain, and they really understand the changes that show up in the pictures. So I'm a fisheries biologist working in the driest state in the country, and so I'm really interested in finding ways to get water. And I'd like to propose to you that collaborative stewardship is a way that we can do that. So this is about creeks, collaboration, and creeks, water, and collaboration, and cows. So, whoops. This is a picture of Susie Creek, which is about 30 miles west of here in 1978. And this is the same picture of Susie Creek in fall of 2015. And during the 4th year of the most severe drought many of us have ever seen that have lived and worked here a long time. So how did we get that water? I think I'd like to propose to you that the collaborative stewardship had something to do with all that water. And in my mind, the story goes something like this. We're sharing a common vision, which could be achieving proper functioning condition on a stream. We work together, we change grazing practices, and that grows plants, and that makes the stream function often. And lately, beaver have found their way into this equation. Not always, but a lot of times beaver have found these functional streams and become effective and successful there. And all that is equaling water and all that goes with it. And I'd like to emphasize this whole story is just something that's unfolding over time. The last chapter has not been written yet. So there's some good reasons to work together. There's a lot of good reasons, but here's an important one. The district that I work on in Elko is about 12 million acres, but there's a whole lot of private land mixed in with that 12 million acres, and a lot of it is not fenced out separately. So here's another reason here's a reason to change grazing practices. As most of you know, Nevada is hot and dry, and when things dry out, if left to their own devices, cattle are going to congregate on a stream because that's the only source of succulent forage and water when everything else is dry. But I'd like to talk to you about ways to change grazing practices so that we, whoops, uh-oh. Push that button again. Okay. Oh, sorry about that. I'm all done now. My question for everyone is, how do we graze an area so that the outside looks like the fence side, and instead of doing something on the right, which when I first started in this business, we were doing a lot of that, which was building little exclosures. No grazing on one side and the wrong kind of grazing on the other side. So the problem with that, I think a lot of you know, is the fences are really hard to maintain. Cattle are usually inside and there are barriers to wildlife. But probably more importantly, as Robin Wignall has told me, a stream she's never seen a stream that's not connected to its watershed. And she's right. So we really need to manage the whole watershed. So mostly what I've focused my career here on in northeastern Nevada, working for BLM since a long time, like John said, since I think 1988, something like that. The thing that I've been most interested in is how do we find grazing strategies that work on streams, successful grazing strategies. And there's all kinds of ways. What I mean when I say spring, fall, rest, if you take a pasture and one year you graze it early, you graze it in the spring, next year you graze it in the fall, next year you rest it. There's a whole bunch of ways, and you don't have to read all the ways, but all I want to share with you is there's a lot of ways, and the only reason I stopped was because I ran out of room on the page. So range improvements is a real important part of this equation. You often need water developments and fencing to implement these rotational grazing practices. And there's techniques like riding and herding and placement of salt and supplements, so that's all part of the story. But if I could reduce that all into one sentence, I would say what these have in common is they all reduce frequency and duration of hot season grazing in riparian areas over time. And it's got to be doable and workable for the person on the ground. I've really learned that lesson. There's Ira Wines with the Spanish Ranch, and with the horse and riding, he does fantastic things at a huge remote area with very little fencing. So I want to show you some examples of successful riparian grazing systems. And one of the reasons that I can show you all this is because we had this fantastic baseline stream survey that was set up on our district back in the late 70s. And we have pictures on pretty much all the streams on BLM lands in Elko and private lands, a lot of private lands in Elko County. And a couple things really stand out if you look through all these old photos. The people were really kind of interesting looking. And I guess, this was the 70s. I guess it's not that far after the 60s for some of you that are my age. Okay, so the guy aside, the other thing that really jumps out in all these pictures is that the streams are really degraded. Just about every stream that we look at. So this, and when I say a degraded stream here, this is wide and shallow. It doesn't have very many plants on the stream banks. It's got a pretty drying out floodplain. And some of the things that John talked about are missing in this photograph. So BLM has been working with a lot of the local ranchers here for a lot of years. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about some of the recovery in the Maggie Creek Basin. And to do that, I need to recognize Dan Gralian and the TS Ranch and all the crews that he has. That they were the people out in the ground and making all this possible. That for the last 25 years, and they're still doing it. They were the ones that really were out moving the cattle and making this happen. So here's one of Dan's streams, Coyote Creek in the Maggie Creek Basin. This is 1977. There's one of those guys. That's Dan. So, yeah, that was Dan in his early days. So, but anyhow, there's one of those degraded streams again, and this stream actually has cutthroat, which is one of our listed. It's a listed species. Pretty degraded. So that's the same spot, and that picture is 2010 after changing grazing practices in the early 90s, working with Dan Gralian and the TS Ranch, and this is some rest mixed with alternating cow-calf pairs. He grazes with cow-calf pairs from April till about July, alternating with rest every other year. So got those results, and that's just a little close-up. Shows you what the stream looks like in terms of from a fish view, fisheries habitat. This is another location. This is Susie Creek, which is in another drainage basin just to the east of Maggie Creek Basin. This is part of Maggie Creek Ranch, has this. This picture was 1978, pretty degraded conditions. This is 1994, just after a few years of changing this prescription to early season grazing. This is a place called Beaver Creek, and I took this picture in 1988, and I thought, wow, this looks a little tough. And this would be a really cool before picture for a slideshow, so it was. And this is working with the 25 Ranch, actually. We built a great big riparian pasture. Nevada Mining Association helped fund it. And the grazing prescription here has been a combination of rest, early use, hot season use, and yearlings and cow-calf pairs. And you can see the results. This is kind of a neat project. This is the North Fork of the Humboldt River, east of here and kind of north of the Deeth area. We built working with the Devil's Gate Ranch, we built a great big riparian pasture and put a spring development and a pipeline system on the uplands. It was rested initially. This is a few years after it was rested. And this takes you up to 2014, and the grazing system has been in place there for a couple of years. It's a spring or fall type system. So, and I want to recognize Jesse Bratz, I don't know if he's here, and his family up at the Squaw Valley Ranch. He's another one of these ranchers that has been working so hard to try and get rotational and prescriptive grazing practices at big scales. So this is a before picture on a place called Middle Rock Creek up in that area, 1977. That guy looks a little better, huh? But at least he didn't have a shirt on. His hair was better. No. So anyhow, so working with Jesse, he's just been rotating the cows through and moving them different directions. That's the same location in 2014. And this is also on the Squaw Valley Ranch. This is Willow Creek, has cutthroat above the Willow Creek Reservoir. This is 2002, so people were better dressed by then, I think. So same location in 2014. And this is a system of rest and spring or fall grazing. This is a picture from West Fork of Beaver Creek. This is up in the Beaver Creek allotment, about 40 miles or so north of Elko. 1988, started changing things in the mid-90s. That's 1999. And I went back there this summer, and this is what it looks like. And this is Eddie King is a ranch manager and works for Ellison Ranching, and he's just done a phenomenal job of moving cattle around this. He has a big allotment, and that allotment's beautiful for sage grouse, for everything. It's well worth seeing if you get a chance. So if I could summarize everything I just talked about into a concept, I would say it's recovery exceeds impact over time, and that time concept is really important. So where did you step into the picture to figure out what's going on? So this picture is on Jack Creek, another stream in the Maggie Creek Basin that Dan Gralian and the TS Ranch have been working on. We started right about 92. We started changing things. You can see it's pretty degraded. In 1998, so the change had been in place for several years. You start to see the recovery processes, the willows starting to come, the floodplain starting to grow vegetation. Here's a picture from the fall of 2004. And the point that I'd like to make here is maybe you hadn't seen what it looked like in 92 or 98, and that was your first day out on the stream. You might think, oh, the grazing level's pretty tough here, This doesn't look so good. But I don't see that. I see these willows that have come in. I see plants growing on the floodplain. And so, I just see it. I see recovery starting to get ahead of impact. This is a flood in the same area of 2006, a really big flood event. And you might go out there and think, well, this doesn't look good. But I see those willows that have grown up are trapping all that alluvial material, which is building up that floodplain and giving that place another medium to grow plants. And so I was out there that day in 2011 when a big fire was coming over the hill, and I actually had to move because it came all the way over to where I was standing. And it burned some of the riparian zone, not all of it. But it didn't take very long for that to recover because you had all the plants there. It responded really well. So take this up to 2015, and same little meager stream that we started with in 92. But because plant recovery was always getting ahead of all these impacts, we had beaver and we had ducks, and cutthroat have actually even found their way back into this stream during, the fourth year, the most severe drought a lot of us have ever seen. So the story, if you hang around long enough, the story always gets more interesting. So here's some beaver kind of showing up on the scene. This is Dry Creek on the Hubbard Vineyard Ranch, Dry Creek, in fourth year of our severe drought. So the beaver thing is really, really interesting. A lot of people know that beaver are really increasing all over the West. We're seeing it here a lot. But I like to think that their success here is really tied to getting a lot of these riparian areas more functional. And I'll show you how that works. This is back on Susie Creek, 1989. Doesn't look too good. Working with John Griggs and the Maggie Creek Ranch, we built a big riparian pasture. This is grazed spring and fall, both oftentimes in the same year. So we got the recovery. We got the willows in there. We got a functional stream. And the beaver found it, and they've created, this is 2012, miles and miles of productive wetlands in that area. So here's another example from Maggie Creek, again working with the TS Ranch. And Newmont actually owns this land, and they're a partner too. This is 1980. In the early 90s, started working to change all the grazing practices in that basin. That's 2001. And beaver found their way into this thing too and created miles and miles of wetlands. So just one final example to show you. This is working up in mountainous areas too, and not just valley bottoms. This is Sheep Creek up in the snowstorm range. 1999, working with Ora Vaca, made a riparian pasture, changed the grazing, started to get recovery, and beaver became established in there. And that's happening all over the place. So the interesting thing about beaver, to me, is all the water storage. So Newmont has a bunch of shallow wells that are scattered up and down the Maggie Creek Basin, and one of these, to track their mine dewatering. Well, the mine dewatering didn't show up here, and this was a shallow well right next to this spot that shows recovery on Maggie Creek. But what it did show was this rise in this shallow aquifer over time. We started changing things right here in the early 90s, and this scale is 2 feet between increments, and you can see over time that there's a steady rise in a couple feet in that shallow aquifer, and right up into our 4 years of our most severe drought. So a lot of water storage going on from the beaver. So if you look at this from the air, I really like this picture. Took it from a helicopter in April of 2012. You can just get a feel for how much water storage is going on from the recovery and from the beaver becoming established in that basin. Incidentally, you can see here where all these wetlands partially stopped a fire in 2012 or 2007. So Greg Simons, some of you may know him. He's out of Park City, Utah. He got me interested in thinking about how can we quantify all this stuff at big scales, and remote sensing is a way to do that. So we've done a couple studies partnering with Newmont and the TS Ranch to try and look at all this at big scales using satellite and aerial imagery. But I wanted to share this particular set of slides. This is work done by Whitehorse Associates out of Logan. And what this shows, as in just 4 years, from 2006 to 2010, beaver dams went from 107 to 271, and ponded water, shown by the dark blue there, increased by 9 miles. So I said, it's all an unfolding story, and I keep learning something new every year. So I'll go back to my example on Susie Creek again. When I took this picture in 1989, I had no idea how this whole story was going to unfold, and I still don't. So I mentioned that we worked with John Griggs on the Maggie Creek Ranch to create a riparian pasture and get the recovery needed, the willows and the vegetation to attract the beaver, which came in. But I didn't tell you the full story, because by 2012, the beaver had moved on, which is a normal part of the process in these settings. They drowned out the willows. The habitat's just probably not suitable for them. So it kind of transitioned into a cattail marsh. So by 2014, it looks like it's going to maybe a single channel and a wet meadow. And here we are to 2015. And now what I see out there, instead of just water, I see this big reservoir of rich organic soil. And I'm wondering what all this runoff is going to do in that site this coming year. So I kind of got a clue from on a trip, because of all these neat things that are happening. John Griggs and I, a cowboy from Nevada and a BLM fish head, got a fish head is supposed to be a derogatory term for fish biologist, but I kind of like it. So, I don't know. So anyhow, of all things, we got an invite to go to this conference in Tufts University in the Boston area, and those were really smart people there. It was world scientists, climate change people, and all this. And it's kind of scary, wasn't it, John? I was scared. Yeah, it was scary. So, but anyhow, this group, this is Jim Laurie, a restoration ecologist, a real restoration ecologist with this group. They're a nonprofit, and they're really devoted to using natural processes, restoring ecosystems to reverse effects of climate change. And they're particularly interested in land use practices like planned grazing to get things like carbon and organic matter into the soil. And there's a huge, once you do that, there's a huge effect. So I learned a lot, and what I learned kind of helped me understand something that I've seen all these years, and I never could explain it very well. How come there's so much water on the side with the plants? And what I learned from the conference was that the plants, and whether it's plants that lead to beaver dams and wetlands and all this, they have such a powerful role taking carbon out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis and getting sugars and things into the soils and developing a very complex soil ecosystem with all the microbes and carbon and organic material and all this stuff. All this stuff in the soil makes it really hold water. So I was thinking about all this, and I was out in Dixie Creek about a month later. Dixie Creek is not far from Elko. And beaver had been in this area, but they had recently moved on. And instead there was all this deep soil. And I was thinking about all this organically rich soil that I learned about in Boston. And so I asked Jim Laurie if he would help me develop a hypothetical example to see how much water and carbon might be being stored in this area. So fortunately, because we have all those pictures, I can go back in time. So that was Dixie Creek right in the same spot in 1989. Pretty degraded. We didn't have a lot of storage in the floodplain. Changed grazing, started to get the healing processes going. Here, like a lot of places, beaver came in and created all these wetlands. And like a lot of places, they're starting to move out, but they left all this deep, rich organic soil. So using that example, Jim Laurie helped me do a sort of some hypothetical calculations here. And if you, shows you the change, and it's in about an area about 4.5 miles. And we had to have some assumptions to get some volume measurements. We said there was a couple feet of rich organic soil, had 10% organic material, 6% carbon. It was an area, a volume area, an area about 69 acres. So anyhow, if you agree with those assumptions, then you come up with a figure of about 186,000 tons of new organic rich soil. And that equates to about over 10,000 tons of carbon. So if you're a climate scientist, that's probably a cool number of carbon being taken out of the atmosphere. But if you're a fisheries biologist and you're looking for water, you really like this down here. There was a speaker there, a scientist there, that said for every 1% increase in soil carbon, there's a corresponding increase in 60,000 gallons per acre of water holding capacity in that soil. So that helped me explain all this water I'm seeing. So Jim Laurie says nature wants to be wet, and that kind of made sense to me. So stepping back and looking at all this at big scales and time and space, I want to use an example from the Susie Creek Basin, but I want to say that there's a lot of collaborative watershed scale restoration going on with the voices with A.G. Smith, with Jesse Bratz, with Dan Graylian, with big watersheds all over Elko County. So this is just one example. So that whole watershed is about 200 square miles, and there's a lot of partners that have been working since the early 90s. We built all these fences and made all these pastures, and Tom Warren's here, and he's reseeded hundreds of thousands of acres of rangelands. And if Terry Barton's here, she's worked on the weeds, and there's been a lot of partners that have made this basin what it is. And Trout Unlimited helped us with a remote sensing project just to quantify some of these changes. And what they came up with was over the past 20 to 30 years, depending on the imagery sets, riparian vegetation increased by 100 acres. Beaver dams went from 0 to 139. Open water increased by 20 acres. Length of wetland stream increased by 3 miles. And there was a 32% increase in photosynthetic activity when you took out effects of drought and fires. But now I know, I knew that was important, but now I know it's really important, that photosynthesis. So just a picture of all the wildlife that has showed up during the drought years on Susie Creek. And you remember what it looked like when we started. So I can't tell you about Susie Creek without really recognizing those people that were out on the ground that really made it happen. And Mitch and Rhonda Heggie have an allotment in the top of the watershed. John Griggs has several allotments in the lower 2/3. And that guy with John,
On the left.
yeah, that's John. He's a film producer from the United Kingdom, and somehow he heard about all this, and he was doing a documentary on water in the West, and so he found John out there in Susie Creek. And I can't conclude this talk without recognizing the Shoe Soul Resource Management Group, A.G. Smith and Steve and Robin Boyce, and the Home Ranch. I don't know them personally, but there's many partners who, they wrote the book on collaborative stewardship. And I work mostly on the west part of the district, so I don't get over there too often, but when I went there on a tour in 2012, they had this whole thing going, this collaborative work, creating plants, bringing in beaver, and equaling water. Saw it working there. What's that? I'm sorry. Okay. Okay, that's it. Thank you.